Farmer was evicted, so rail barons took his land. By morning, an Apache war band rode into his yard. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Picture this. It's the late 1800s, the wild, untamed frontier of the American West. The land was everything. What you owned was who you were. For Samuel Harris, a poor farmer with a small patch of land, life was tough but steady. He lived alone on his farm, just barely making ends meet. His crops were his livelihood, his land was all he had, and yet, it wasn't enough. The railroad barons wanted it. They were ruthless men who built railroads to connect the East and West, cutting through the land that once was free for farmers and settlers. Samuel had heard of them before. These wealthy tycoons who cared only for progress and for money. The law was on their side, and they didn't care who they had to trample over to get what they wanted. Samuel's farm was in their way. They had the power, they had the means, and they had no intention of letting a poor farmer like Samuel stand in their way. They sent men to evict him, and the law made sure to back them up. One morning, Samuel woke to the sound of horses. A group of men, led by a slick-looking figure in a black suit, arrived at his farm, documents in hand. "You're being evicted, Mr. Harris," the man said with a smirk, his voice smooth and cold. "This land belongs to the railroad now. You'll need to leave by sundown." Samuel stood there, stunned. His knees were weak, his hands trembling, but his voice stayed steady. "I've worked this land for years," he said. "I've poured my sweat and blood into it. You can't just take it from me." The man laughed. "We can, and we will." As Samuel watched them tear down his farm, his heart shattered. His entire life had been built on that land, and now, in a matter of hours, it was all gone. The railroad men didn't care. They were already planning the next phase of their conquest. But as the sun set that day, a strange thing happened. From the distance, Samuel heard something. The thudding of horses' hooves, growing louder and louder. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then the noise was undeniable. A war band was riding toward his land. He didn't know it yet, but the Apache were coming. These warriors, who had been watching the railroad barons from afar, had seen what had happened to Samuel. They had seen the injustice, and they weren't going to stand by while a man was trampled by the greed of the railroads. The Apache had their own code of honor, one that involved protecting the land and the people who belonged to it. And they had no intention of letting the railroad barons destroy everything in their path, not without facing the consequences. As the first Apache warriors rode into Samuel's yard, he couldn't believe his eyes. What was this? Was this a dream? He thought about running, about hiding, but something inside him told him to stand tall, to face this moment head-on. The Apache warriors dismounted, their faces hard, their eyes cold with determination. They looked at Samuel, and then, without a word, they turned toward the railroad men's camp. They were going to make sure the railroad barons learned a lesson they'd never forget. The Apache warriors stood silently in Samuel Harris's yard, their eyes scanning the destruction caused by the railroad barons. The land, once full of life and promise, now lay in ruins. The faint scent of burning wood lingered in the air as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren fields. Samuel, still in shock from the brutal eviction, watched as the Apache warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. He had never imagined that help would come in the form of these fierce, proud warriors. One of the Apache men, the leader, approached Samuel. His face was weathered and stern, but there was a glint of respect in his eyes. "You fight for your land, farmer," the leader said in a low, steady voice. "We respect that. But the railroad men, they have taken what is not theirs. We will show them the price of their greed." Samuel barely understood the weight of the words, but he could feel the resolve in the warrior's tone. He nodded slowly, his mind racing. What could he do now? The land was lost, and yet, somehow, the Apache had given him hope. The leader turned his horse and motioned for the others to follow. They rode toward the camp where the railroad men had set up their makeshift headquarters. Samuel stood at the edge of his ruined land, unsure whether to follow or stay behind. But as he watched the Apache warriors disappear into the dusk, something within him stirred. He wasn't sure what was about to unfold, but he knew one thing for certain. This was not just about his land anymore. It was about standing up to those who would destroy everything in their path for profit. As night fell, the air grew cooler, and the sound of hooves in the distance grew louder. Samuel turned and walked toward his cabin, the soft crunch of the dirt beneath his boots the only sound in the stillness. He tried to sleep, but his mind was too restless. Thoughts of the Apache warriors and the railroad barons plagued his every thought. What would happen next? Would the Apache succeed in their mission? Would the railroad men retaliate? The tension in the air was thick with uncertainty. By the time dawn broke, Samuel was already awake, standing by his door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. As the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Samuel saw them. The Apache warriors had returned, but this time they were not alone. Behind them, riding in a perfect line, were hundreds of men, more Apache, more warriors, and more riders who had come to stand with them. The warriors had called for reinforcements, and now the railroad men would face the wrath of not just a few, but an entire tribe. Samuel watched in awe as the warriors rode into his yard once again, their faces grim and determined. They had made a statement. They were not afraid. They would not back down. The Apache leader dismounted from his horse and approached Samuel once more. The barons will learn what happens when they take from the earth. Without giving back, the leader said. Samuel's heart raced as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. This was no longer just a fight for his land. This was a fight for justice. The warriors had made their move, and the railroad men would soon feel the consequences of their actions. The Apache warriors stood in the early morning light, their faces hardened by the weight of the journey ahead. Samuel Harris, still reeling from the events of the previous day, stood beside them, watching as the warriors prepared for the confrontation. The land he had fought so hard for was now a battleground between the greed of the railroad men and the justice of the Apache. The warrior leader, his eyes sharp and focused, approached Samuel once more. Today, we fight not just for land, but for what is right. These men who take what is not theirs must learn the price of their actions, he said, his voice steady. Samuel nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't a fighter, but in that moment, he knew he had to stand with the Apache. The warriors mounted their horses, their movements fluid and practiced, a well-oiled machine ready for battle. Samuel watched them, unsure of what role he would play in the unfolding events. But the Apache were not just warriors. They were men of honor, and they fought not for personal gain, but for the land, for justice, and for the future. As the warriors rode out toward the railroad camp, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, a steady rhythm that grew louder with each passing second. The tension in the air was palpable. Samuel could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, as if he were standing at the crossroads of a new era. The railroad barons, with their vast wealth and power, had assumed they could take whatever they wanted. But today, they would learn that the land was not theirs to steal. They had underestimated the resolve of the Apache, and now they would pay the price. The first sign of trouble came when the Apache warriors arrived at the camp. The railroad men, who had been arrogantly preparing for the next phase of their conquest, froze when they saw the Apache riders approach. They had expected resistance, but nothing like this. A group of men, led by their foreman, stepped forward, hands hovering over their weapons. "What is this?" the foreman demanded, his voice shaking. The Apache leader dismounted, his eyes cold and calculating. "You have taken what does not belong to you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of injustice. "Today, we take it back." The foreman sneered. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The Apache warriors remained calm, their faces unreadable. They knew what was at stake. They had no intention of backing down. As the confrontation escalated, Samuel watched in silence, his heart racing. He had never been part of a battle like this before. He had always worked the land, never fought for it. But now, as he stood with the Apache, he felt a strange sense of purpose. The land was his, and he would not let it be taken without a fight. The first shot rang out, breaking the tense silence. A single shot, fired from the railroad camp, was the spark that ignited the fire. The Apache warriors responded in kind, their arrows flying through the air with deadly precision. The battle was swift, but fierce. The railroad men, caught off guard by the sudden assault, struggled to defend themselves. They had come with weapons, but they had not come prepared for the wrath of the Apache. Samuel stood back, watching as the warriors fought with honor and fury. This was their land, and they would defend it with everything they had. The railroad men, realizing they were outmatched, began to retreat, but it was too late. The Apache had already reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. As the dust settled and the sound of battle faded, Samuel stood in the yard, surrounded by the warriors who had helped him. He looked at the land, now free from the grasp of the railroad, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The Apache had fought for him, for the land, and for justice. The railroad barons had been defeated, their plans thwarted by the strength and honor of the Apache. Samuel had lost everything once, but today he had gained something far more important, a future where the land belonged to those who fought for it, and a sense of justice that would never be taken away. The dust was settling, and the air, once filled with the sounds of battle, had turned eerily quiet. Samuel stood at the edge of his land, still trying to process what had just transpired. The Apache had fought fiercely, and the railroad men, their arrogance shattered, had been driven away. The land that had once seemed lost to the greed of powerful men was now free again. But the victory had come at a cost. As the Apache warriors gathered around, their leader approached Samuel once more, his face calm, but with a hint of weariness. "This land belongs to those who fight for it," the leader said, his voice steady. "But it is not just the land that matters. It is the people who protect it." Samuel nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. He had never imagined that the Apache, a people who had been so wronged by the same forces that sought to destroy his life, would come to his aid. The leader reached out and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You fought for this land in your own way, Samuel. And now it is yours. But remember, it is not just the land that defines you. It is the spirit within you that will guide you forward." Samuel felt a deep sense of responsibility settle in his chest. This was not just about reclaiming land. It was about standing up against those who sought to take what was not theirs, to destroy what others had worked for. The Apache had shown him that honor and justice were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the now peaceful landscape, Samuel turned to look at the railroad camp. It was abandoned now, the men who had once tried to seize everything from him scattered and defeated. The camp that had once symbolized greed and exploitation was now a silent reminder of the power of justice. The Apache had left, their mission accomplished, but they had given Samuel more than just land. They had given him hope. "I'll make sure this land is never taken again," Samuel whispered to himself. He didn't know how yet, but he would find a way to protect it, to honor the warriors who had fought for him. And perhaps, someday, he would repay the Apache for their help. The days ahead would not be easy, but Samuel knew he was no longer alone. He had the strength of the Apache behind him, and the resolve to fight for what was right. As the last of the Apache riders disappeared into the distance, Samuel looked at his land, the land that had been saved by the courage and honor of those who understood the true cost of justice. It was his now, but more importantly, it was free. And that freedom, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. The days following the battle were filled with a strange sense of calm, but also uncertainty. Samuel Harris had spent his life working the land, fighting to survive, and now, after the Apache had come to his aid, everything had changed. His land was free from the grasp of the railroad barons, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As he stood by the edge of his field, looking at the horizon, Samuel wondered how long this peace would last. The world was a changing place, and the power of the railroad still loomed large. Would they come back for what they had lost? Would the Apache be there to protect him again? Or would Samuel have to fight on his own this time? The sound of hooves interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a lone figure approaching, riding slowly across the dusty road. It was the Apache leader, the one who had guided the warriors during the battle. Samuel felt a surge of gratitude as the man rode up to him. "You look troubled," the Apache leader said, his voice steady. Samuel nodded. I'm grateful for everything you've done, he said, but I'm not sure how to move forward. The land is safe for now, but for how long? The railroad men won't give up so easily. The leader dismounted from his horse and stood beside Samuel, looking out over the land. The railroad barons may come back, he said, but they will find that the land belongs to those who protect it, and those who fight for justice. You have learned that now, Samuel. The question is, will you continue to fight for what is right? Samuel looked at the leader, feeling a weight settle on his shoulders. He had been fighting his entire life, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about protecting the land, the people, and the honor that came with it. I will fight, Samuel said, his voice firm. I won't let them take what's mine again. The leader nodded. Good, he said. You've learned the first lesson, but there is much more to learn. The fight for justice is never over. It takes courage, and it takes resolve. The world will test you, Samuel, but you must stay true to what you believe. With that, the Apache leader turned and mounted his horse. You are not alone, he said, looking back at Samuel. You have allies now, and we will stand with you, if ever you need us. As the Apache leader rode off into the distance, Samuel felt a sense of purpose rise within him. He had been given a second chance, and he would not waste it. The land was his, but it was more than just the earth beneath his feet. It was a symbol of the fight for justice. The Apache had shown him the way, and now it was up to him to carry that torch forward. Samuel knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid. He had learned that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Samuel's resolve grew stronger. He worked the land with renewed vigor, making sure that the crops flourished and that the land stayed intact. He kept an eye on the horizon, knowing that danger could come at any time. But with each passing day, he felt more prepared for whatever came next. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he heard the sound of hooves once more. This time, it was not the Apache, but a group of settlers. They had heard of what had happened, of how Samuel had fought for his land and won. They had come, not to take, but to ask for help. We heard about the battle, one of the settlers said. We've been struggling, trying to keep our farms. The railroad is pushing us off our land too. We don't have the strength to fight them, but you do. Will you help us? Samuel looked at them, his heart heavy with the weight of their request. The Apache had taught him to fight for what was right, and now, here were people who needed his help. He thought about the lessons he had learned, about the responsibility that came with protecting the land, and he knew what he had to do. I'll help you, Samuel said, his voice strong. We'll fight together. This land belongs to those who protect it, and we will protect it. As the days went by, Samuel Harris found himself standing at the center of something much bigger than just his own land. Word had spread throughout the valley about how he had stood up to the railroad barons, how he had fought with the Apache to reclaim what was rightfully his. Now, settlers from nearby farms were coming to him for help, and Samuel realized that the fight for justice was far from over. The railroad men hadn't given up. They had been humiliated, but their greed was insatiable, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before they came for the land again. But this time, he would not stand alone. He had allies, farmers, settlers, and even more Apache warriors who had sworn to fight by his side. The first few weeks were tense. The settlers, having learned from Samuel's example, began to organize. Together, they fortified their homes, built defenses, and prepared for whatever was coming next. Samuel led the charge, using the knowledge he had gained from the Apache to train the settlers in tactics they would need to defend their land. But even as they strengthened their resolve, Samuel knew that something was missing. The railroad men had more resources, more men, and more weapons. If they were going to win, they would need a plan that would level the playing field. One evening, as Samuel sat by the fire with a group of settlers, a familiar sound interrupted the quiet. Hooves. The Apache were returning. Samuel stood up, his heart racing. He didn't know whether to feel relief or anxiety. The Apache had already helped him once, but would they come again? As the warriors rode into the clearing, the leader of the Apache tribe dismounted and walked toward Samuel. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. We have heard the call, the leader said. You are not alone in this fight. The railroad men will come, but they will not succeed. We will stand with you. Samuel felt a surge of gratitude, but also fear. He had seen the strength of the Apache in battle, but this was different. This wasn't just about fighting for survival. This was a fight to protect everything they held dear. The Apache leader placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "We fight for what is right," he said. "We fight for justice, for the land, for the people. This is a fight worth winning." Over the next few weeks, the settlers and the Apache worked together, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They dug trenches, built barricades, and set traps along the paths the railroad men would likely take. It was a race against time, as they knew the railroad men would not wait long before launching their attack. And then, one morning, it came. The first signs of the railroad men appeared on the horizon. Samuel stood at the front lines, his heart pounding in his chest. The Apache were with him, their faces grim and resolute. The settlers were ready, armed with rifles and pistols, their hands steady despite the fear in their hearts. As the railroad men advanced, Samuel gave the signal, and the battle began. The Apache warriors moved like shadows, swift and deadly, using the terrain to their advantage. The settlers, though inexperienced, fought with the courage of men who had nothing left to lose. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, mingling with the war cries of the Apache. Samuel fought alongside them, his rifle steady in his hands. He had never been a soldier, but he had learned to fight for what was his, and now he was fighting for something bigger, the future of the land and the people he had come to care for. The railroad men, once so sure of their victory, were thrown off balance by the fierce resistance. They had underestimated the resolve of the people they sought to crush. The battle raged on, but with each passing minute, the railroad men realized they were losing. They had come for the land, but they were about to lose much more than that. By the time the sun set, the battle was over. The railroad men had been driven back, their forces scattered, and their morale shattered. The Apache and the settlers stood victorious, though the cost had been high. The land was still theirs, and it would remain so. Samuel looked around at the faces of those who had fought with him, his allies, his friends, and he knew that they had not just won a battle. They had won something much greater, a future where the land belonged to those who fought for it, and a future where justice would always have a place. The victory over the railroad men had been a hard-earned one, but as Samuel stood on his land, now free from their grasp, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The settlers and the Apache had fought together, and though they had driven the invaders away, Samuel knew the price of peace in the American West. It was never permanent, and the cost was always high. Days turned into weeks, and life on the land began to settle into a new rhythm. Samuel worked alongside the settlers, ensuring the fields were planted, the fences were mended, and the community that had come together to defend the land began to rebuild. They were no longer just farmers and settlers. They were a brotherhood, forged in the heat of battle. But in the back of Samuel's mind, a lingering worry gnawed at him. The railroad men hadn't given up. They would return, that much he was sure of. The question was when, and how would they come? Would they send more men? Would they try another way to take the land? The Apache, having kept their word and helped defend the settlers, began to leave. Their leader, the man who had guided them through the fight, came to Samuel one last time before riding off with his people. "This land is yours now," the Apache leader said, his voice as steady as it had been on the day of the battle. "But remember, it's not just the land that matters. It's the people. Protect them, and protect what is right. This land will not stay free unless you fight for it." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of the man's words settle deep within him. "I won't forget," he said, his voice firm. "We'll fight if we have to. This is our home now." The Apache leader looked at him one last time before turning his horse around and riding off into the distance, disappearing into the rugged landscape of the West. The days that followed were peaceful, but the tension remained. Samuel knew the railroad men were biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as Samuel was working by the barn, he heard the sound of horses. He turned to see a group of men riding up to the farm. At first, he thought it might be the Apache returning, but as the riders came closer, he saw the unmistakable insignia on their clothing. Railroad men. They had come back, and this time, they weren't alone. The men dismounted, their eyes cold and calculating. The leader, The same man who had come to evict Samuel all those weeks ago stepped forward. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "But you've forgotten one thing. This land belongs to the railroad, and we're taking it back." Samuel stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this day would come, but he was ready. The settlers, who had been working the land alongside him, gathered behind him, their faces set with determination. They wouldn't let the railroad men take their homes again. "This land is ours," Samuel said, his voice steady, "and we won't give it up without a fight." The leader sneered. "You think you can stop us? We have more men, more resources. You can't win this fight." Samuel looked around at the settlers and the few remaining Apache warriors who had stayed behind to watch over them. "We've already won once," Samuel said, "and we'll win again." The leader of the railroad men didn't speak again. Instead, he signaled to his men to draw their weapons. Samuel knew that the battle was about to begin. This time, it would be different. The settlers had learned from their past struggles, and the Apache had taught them the value of standing together. They wouldn't be intimidated. They wouldn't back down. The land they fought for was worth more than gold or power. It was their home, and they would protect it with everything they had. As the first shot rang out, breaking the tense silence, Samuel felt his heart race, but there was no fear. Only the deep, unwavering resolve to protect the future of the land that had become their own. The battle had erupted in full force. The railroad men, determined to take back what they believed was theirs, were met with fierce resistance from the settlers and the Apache who had chosen to stay. The air was thick with dust and the sound of gunfire as the men and women of the land fought to protect what they had worked for. Samuel stood at the front lines, his rifle steady in his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. He had fought this battle before, but now it was different. Now, he wasn't just fighting for his own land. He was fighting for the future of all those who had come to call this place home. The settlers, armed with rifles and determination, stood side by side with the Apache, who moved like shadows in the dusk, swift and deadly. The railroad men, with all their resources and firepower, had underestimated the strength of those who lived on this land. They had assumed that their money and their machines would be enough to crush the resistance. They had been wrong. The battle raged on for hours, with both sides taking heavy losses. The settlers had fought valiantly, using the land to their advantage. The Apache, with their knowledge of the terrain and their unmatched skill with bow and arrow, proved to be a force to be reckoned with. The railroad men, despite their superior numbers, were being pushed back, their lines breaking as the settlers and Apache closed in on them. Samuel moved through the chaos, his eyes scanning the battlefield, watching as the tide began to turn. The railroad men were starting to lose ground. They had been confident when they arrived, but now they were retreating, their morale shattered by the unrelenting spirit of the people they had sought to dominate. As the battle continued, Samuel found himself face to face with the leader of the railroad men, the same man who had come to evict him from his land all those weeks ago. The man's eyes were filled with rage, but also with fear. He had underestimated Samuel, just as he had underestimated the Apache and the settlers. "You think you've won?" The man spat, his voice filled with venom. "This land will never belong to you. The railroad will take it back." Samuel's gaze was steady. "This land is ours," he said calmly, his voice firm, "and we will fight to keep it." The railroad leader raised his rifle, but before he could fire, an Apache warrior appeared behind him, swift as a shadow. The warrior's bowstring snapped, and the arrow flew true, striking the man in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, his rifle falling from his hands. The battlefield went silent for a moment, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Samuel stood over the fallen man, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. But he knew this was not just about one man. This was about justice. This was about protecting the land. The railroad men, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat in earnest, their morale shattered, their resolve broken. The settlers and the Apache pressed on, driving them back until they were out of sight, leaving only the silence of the land behind. The battle was over, and the land was safe, for now. But Samuel knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. It would take more than just one victory to ensure that the railroad men would never come back. It would take the strength of the people, the unity of the settlers and the Apache, and the unwavering resolve to protect what was rightfully theirs. As Samuel looked out over the land, now free from the grasp of the railroad barons, he felt a sense of pride and peace. The land was theirs, and it would remain theirs as long as they stood together. He turned to the settlers, their faces weary but triumphant. "We've won today," he said, his voice strong. "But we must be ready to defend this land, always. The fight for justice never ends." The settlers nodded, their eyes filled with determination. Samuel had led them to victory once, and they would follow him again. The Apache, standing at the edge of the clearing, gave a nod of approval. The battle had been won, but the true test was yet to come. For now, though, the land was theirs, and as long as they stood together, nothing could take it from them. The days that followed the battle were filled with both peace and anticipation. Samuel had won, and the settlers had reclaimed their land, but the cost of that victory was always lingering in his mind. They had fought hard, and they had triumphed, but Samuel knew the road ahead would not be easy. The railroad barons would not rest. The threat of their return was never far off. As the settlers rebuilt, Samuel spent his days walking the land, his eyes scanning the horizon. He often found himself standing by the edge of the fields, lost in thought. The Apache warriors who had stayed behind with them had long since ridden off to their homeland, but their teachings remained with Samuel. They had shown him what it meant to stand for something greater than himself, to fight for justice, and to protect the land. As he stood there one evening, watching the sun set over the land, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the Apache leader, the one who had first ridden to his aid all those months ago. The leader's face was calm, his eyes steady as they looked out over the land. "You've done well, Samuel," the leader said. "This land is yours, and the people are safe, for now. But you must remember, the fight for justice is never over. The railroad men will come again, and when they do, you must be ready." Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of the leader's words. He had already learned that lesson once, and now he knew it was a lesson he would need to carry with him for the rest of his life. "I won't forget," Samuel said, his voice firm. "We will be ready." The Apache leader gave a small, approving nod before turning his horse and riding off into the distance, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the fields. Samuel's heart swelled with pride as he looked around at the land he had fought for, the land that was now free. It was his, and it would remain his, but only if he continued to stand strong, if he continued to fight. He knew that the world around him was changing, and the battles would come in many forms. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. The settlers, the Apache, and even the land itself had stood with him, and together, they had built something strong, something worth protecting. The railroad barons would come again, but Samuel was ready. He had the strength of the land, the support of his allies, and the fire of justice burning in his heart. As the stars began to twinkle above, Samuel turned and walked back toward the settlement. He knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew that no matter what happened, he would never give up. The fight for the land was far from over, but as long as he had breath in his lungs, Samuel would stand for what was right, just as the Apache had taught him. The land, the people, and the future were worth fighting for. And Samuel Harris was ready to fight, whatever it took. Experience the thrilling world of Western stories where justice, land, and honor are fought for at every turn. Follow Samuel Harris, a simple farmer who battles against the greed of railroad barons and the relentless pursuit of those who seek to steal his land. With the help of fierce Apache warriors, Samuel finds himself in the heart of a fight that will determine the future of his home. In this gripping tale of perseverance and bravery, the stakes are high as settlers and Native American allies unite to protect what is rightfully theirs. In these Western stories, the struggle for land is not just about survival, but about the fight for justice and the strength to stand against powerful adversaries. As the battle intensifies, Samuel learns that the fight for freedom never truly ends, but with the support of those around him, he can stand firm against any enemy. This story is a perfect example of the timeless themes of Western stories, where honor, courage, and the land itself are tested by the forces of greed. In these Western stories, we see how communities come together in the face of adversity, united in the fight for what they believe in, no matter the cost. With tension building and danger lurking at every corner, Samuel must prepare for the next wave of conflict, as the railroad men are bound to return. But with his allies by his side, Samuel is ready to defend his land and keep the spirit of justice alive in the heart of the American West.